Okay, good morning. As a means of introduction, I'm Harold Jones, and I'm going to attempt to be the moderator of our panel today. The United States has a lot of fast sprinters, some of the best in the world. And whenever they assemble for a relay, the expectation is that they'll be winning or close to it. But every now and then, something happens and the baton is dropped. And then the designation is a DNF, did not finish. When I think about spiritual legacy, I think about passing that baton on and not wanting to end up with a did not finish. So we have a panel here today, which I will introduce, and we'll get a chance to talk about the challenges of passing on a spiritual legacy. So on my right is Chris Nichols. Chris is a father of 2 sons and a granddad as well. Kevin has 3 daughters. Don is a father of 3 and a grandfather of 2. And Tim is a father of 8 and a grandfather of 3 and counting.
That's right. Is that the latest count?
So we're going to get started. And as a matter of, just wanted each of our panelists to first share as an opening statement why they believe passing on a spiritual legacy is important, and when or in what manner they reach that consideration. So maybe we could start with Chris. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, take it off.
Great. So I would say I don't think it's important to pass on a spiritual legacy. I think that's culturally acceptable, but I think a spiritual legacy by itself is too vague, and it leads to a sense of confusion to children. I think it's really important to pass on a Christian legacy. And so my determination has been that I would help my children, their wives, and now I'm intent on my grandson knowing what it means to follow Jesus in a very specific way. Probably because I work with college students and have for over 3 decades. I watched what happens when people become spiritual rather than Christian. And I don't consider that particularly helpful to them. So my goal has been for my children to understand what it looks like to follow Jesus in a complex world that desires spirituality but not specifics. And I came to that determination early on in my own spiritual life when I realized that transformation can only happen in relationship to a God who's real, personal, and has a specific place in history. And I've watched my children experience the same thing. So over the decades, as I've watched my sons grow up and marry and then one have a child, I realized how important that is for them to try to navigate all the ins and outs of life, the excitements and disappointments, and to know how to make choices that allow them to be all they were called to be. So,
Kevin?
I guess I would say that, for me, it's been a journey of coming to understand that, my job as a father in some ways is to be their guide toward pointing them toward Jesus and pointing them toward their relationship with Christ. And again, like as Chris said, they do live in such a spiritually ambiguous place where, spirituality is all over the place with regard to my kids, who are the oldest of which is only in high school. But this idea that whatever you believe is fine is sort of the thing that we have to sort of come up against on a regular basis. And so, being very specific about the fact that you're really trying to teach your kids about who Jesus is and how to have a personal relationship with him and how that is supposed to be directive in their life is critical. For me, I think one of the things that really was a profound moment for me, and it happened when I was 24 years old, was I took a group of guys who I knew very, very well to a Young Life camp, and while we were there, I was really excited about the chance to have them hear the gospel presented over the course of 5 days and hopefully make a commitment to Christ themselves. And the very first night, we came back to the cabin after hearing someone speak about this idea of a God in heaven who loved them, a Father in heaven who loved them, who wanted to be in relationship with them, who created them in his own image. And I was very excited to sit down with these guys and process this and talk about what that looked like for them. And for them, the conversation just sort of fell completely flat. Every question we asked, they didn't seem to answer. They just didn't seem to be very interested. And we finally, after a short period of time, gave up and sent them down to the boathouse to flirt with girls and eat ice cream. And Dave Adele, who was this guy who was a leader with me, the two of us were sort of discouraged. And as we started to walk down the boathouse, Dave, who was a lot older than I was and much wiser, all of a sudden he said, "I think I figured out what's wrong." And he said, of all the 8 guys in that room, only one of them has a relationship with his dad. The other ones, their parents were divorced, their parents were alcoholics. I mean, their dads were specifically. And they just had no connection to their dads at all. And so as a father, one of the things that became really important to me at that point in time, or I wasn't a father at the time, but a concept that became important to me, even at 24 before I even met my wife, was at some point in time, if someone were to sit down and have that kind of conversation with my kids, I want to be the kind of earthly father that points them toward their heavenly Father. So for me, that just became an important connective point.
Christian legacy. I want to go back to where I came from, and my legacy and grandparents and people who started out in Scotland were very poor. They were fishermen, but they loved God and they loved Jesus. And they exemplified that on a daily basis. You never went to their house on a Sunday afternoon unless there were 20 people around the table, or taking in people. I know our family took in a number of people and adopted them over the years. And I think from the experience that I've had growing up in that environment, all the way up through my father, really has played a role in helping me to bring to my kids some kind of a Christian legacy that I think is important. I want them to know about faith. I want them to know who Jesus is. I want them to know that they can go to Jesus at any time, whether it's in celebration or something that has happened that's a negative thing. It's not about the money. It's not about having a big house. It's about having a human touch with people. And that's what I hope that I'm passing on to my kids, and I think it's really important. Although I must say I have 3 kids, and it's like Mo, Dick, and Harry, the 3 of them, but we'll get to that later.
So I spend my work week working with people on their legacy, because we do estate planning as a law practice. And people are consumed with how much money they're going to leave their kids and how many taxes they're going to be able to save and so forth, which is a form of stewardship, and that's all good. But a big part of determining their legacy and helping them, coaching them into looking at a bigger picture of their legacy is thinking about what value they're conveying to their families and to everybody else involved. Personally, I'm not a legacy advisor. But I am, in a way, to my kids, a legacy advisor, because I think the best thing I can do to determine that legacy is just by setting an example in what ways I can. My example is far from perfect, and one of the hardest things is teaching your kids to know that that you fall short and you confess and pray from James 5. And it's hard for kids to understand, why is Dad so imperfect? Why does he screw up? Why does he yell? And why do these things happen that would make us unhappy sometimes? But it's all part of being a dad, and eventually, though you fall on your face, you pick up again, and you set that example of continuing to serve God to the end. So that's my little synopsis, anyway.
Great, thank you. So one of the questions that was submitted also is they'd like to hear the panelists talk about what role your dad played in your spiritual growth.
My father came to faith at 16 out of poverty and a very complex and difficult family situation. His mom died when he was 2 weeks old. He had 3 different stepmothers. They moved a lot. So for my father, faith was a very alive, very real, very dynamic piece of his life. And so I grew up in a small town in California in a Presbyterian church. Well, I think the role that my father played in that was making sure that we didn't just attend church and be in a close-knit community, but that we knew how to express faith. My father was articulate about his faith, he was passionate about his faith, and played a central role in helping us engage with Scripture and engage with one another. So he was very lively faith, and was a model of what it meant to believe and to engage not only us but other people in faith.
I had a different experience in that my father was not a believer. And my dad had a similar story in some ways. His dad died when he was 2 years old. So my grandfather was hit by a train, and my dad was raised just by his mom. And it wasn't until I think he was about 17 years old that he actually had a stepfather who was not a particularly good role model. He was an alcoholic and kind of a wayward kind of dude. But one of the things I think I learned from my father more than anything else, and I think when we think about the idea of being created in the image of God, we're all marred, but I think there's the glimpses of it of that particular picture in all of us, and even in my own dad. And so I think the thing that I learned the most from him, or I was most sort of formed with regard to him, is that he really delighted in his children. If we are children of God and God delights in us, my father delighted in us. That was one of the things I think that was the most amazing thing to grow up with a person who didn't have anything modeled out for him, and yet he found the capacity to find a way to try to always be engaged with his kids, always want to spend time with them, and just to be someone who delighted in us. And I felt, that idea of being a child of someone who was cared for deeply from him.
My father was a rock. He was a rock in many, many ways in my life. And he was consistently available to my sister and I. He would know how to discipline in a way that you felt proud almost to be disciplined. I mean, he was that good at it. He never had a lot of money. He worked hard. He was the kind of individual that I look back now and say, if I had to have a mentor growing up, it would be my dad. He was that kind of a guy. And yet we all have flaws. And he would say he has many. I can recognize perhaps some of them. But I'll just tell you one little story about him that exemplifies that we're not all perfect. After my dad passed on, he was 91, I got a phone call from my sister, 10 o'clock at night. Don, we have to meet. We have to meet. Okay, we'll go and meet. And we met at Starbucks and so forth. And he said, did you know that Dad was married before he married my mother? What? What are you talking about? Sure enough, he had been married to somebody else who was kind of like a 24-hour, let's go to New Hampshire, get married, Britney Spears type thing. And to this day, I hope when I do see him that he'll have a little explanation about why that happened. But I still love him. He was a pretty good trackster and so forth in high school, and I challenged him one day to a road race. I mean, a sprint. We went down to the Charles River. He beat me so bad that I fell on purpose, to say, oh, I tripped, running to try and keep up with him. But he was always present. He's a rock.
My relationship with my dad was a good one. I was the youngest of 5 kids. Dad was a man of the church, and he probably grew up in a mixed Catholic and Protestant home. But he was a perfectionist, and anybody who lives with a perfectionist, you know what that's like. So he was tough on us. But he had a very kind heart under it all. And my dad was a Boy Scout leader, and he always took up the end of the trail. He was always the last one, and he always made sure the least of the pack got through the hike. Took care of everybody that was in need. He was a Gideon, and anybody here know what the Gideons were? And they handed out Bibles, and he was very proud of that. He was very active in the community. He was in politics, and everywhere he went, he always put his Christian faith first and his principles first. So, needless to say, that's a powerful example, and I'm very grateful for my dad, and I realize over time how much I better understand him now that I'm an older adult. I can really understand what he was feeling and thinking. I'm very grateful to God.
So we're going to move, that first category was more of an intro and sort of that personal journey. And we're going to move into a category of how-tos, group some of the questions that came in. And so maybe if a couple of you would respond to this. One question is, how did you do well in preparation for having kids? What skills, abilities, strengths do you think prepared you to be a good father? So if a couple of you would want to chime in on that.
We practiced a lot. We had a wonderful opportunity, I think, to be engaged with the youth group here. Ann and I were youth directors for a while. We had always known we had children when we were in our 5th year of marriage, and those first 4.5 years were really helpful for us to establish a relationship with each other, because I think any advice that we can give to kids is that their father has to love their mother. And we really kind of looked at that over the years before we established the idea, okay, I think we're ready to have children now. And we put a lot of time and energy into it. It was certainly a time when we felt close, very close to each other, and God's calling to say, we're ready.
I think what I would echo is that I don't know if Ellen and I prepared to be parents, but we were married 7 years before we had children, and I do think that it's our relationship, putting our relationship first has helped our children, always helped our children. And that way, when we got in places where we struggled, our children didn't become a replacement for one another, which I think deforms the family. So by putting each other first and engaging in our marriage in a healthy way, I think it helped our children and provided a place for them of safety and hope. And then it helped give us perspective. I think parenting always draws out all of your weaknesses and all of the things that don't go well in life. And if you have a healthy marriage, then it gives you something to reflect back on as you wrestle with whatever comes up.
Okay, great. So there's another question, follow up in the same category. Is there anything you wish you had done prior to having kids that would have made you more capable as a dad? Tim, Kevin?
I think that's one of those questions that's really hard to imagine. What would you do differently? I think parenting is always a surprise. My kids are so, as Don had said, he's got Mo, Larry, and Curly. I do too. My kids are so different from each other, and some of them so different from me that I think the biggest thing for me is that we were great. We were the same in the sense that we didn't have kids till we were married for 4 years, and I think that was just the most helpful thing, is that we spent a great deal of time understanding each other and respecting each other, and being able to know what each other's gifts were and what each other's, the places where we needed to be each other's helpmates. So for me, that was probably the most important thing we did. I think the one thing I wish I did differently was maybe to be much more intentional earlier on with my kids with regard to faith development and faith formation. I was a former youth pastor, so my thinking was, I do it the way the model of the church does. I bring my kids to Sunday school. I bring my kids to youth group. I pray with them before they go to bed. I pray with them at mealtime. I pray with them before a test. But really having a spiritual plan for my family wasn't really something I had from the very beginning. And it wasn't until later on, when my oldest was about 13, where we went, wow, we're sort of needing to reevaluate how we've done this and what do we need to do now. So starting early, yeah.
I think I assumed that things would just sort of fall into place, and I certainly didn't have any conscious preparation for being a dad. I suppose if I could have done it differently, I might have anticipated better how diametrically opposite my wife's and my styles are, and considered what that would mean. But I learned fairly early on the job that I could safely defer to most of what my wife had to do as far as child rearing was concerned. I mean, I had definite important parts to play, and was heavily involved with my kids as they were growing up, and still am. But it was important to see that her rules, her discipline, her patterns were important to respect and to give a lot of deference to that. So I found that at first a little bit hard, but then I realized how actually it was very, very comfortable. And we are not a couple that prays together. I often wish we were, but that's just not the style of how our marriage has evolved. And yet, praying separately, I always pray for my wife, and with gratitude and for her strength and abilities.
Thank you.
I think the thing I would have changed is to have been more disciplined when my kids were younger, to be able to really, yes, we read the Bible, we sat around, we talked, we prayed, we said grace, et cetera, but there's an attention that I think was missing when they were really young, that we wanted to get home to them how important it was to be a Christian and how important it was to not just come to church, but take something away from here. We've always come to church. I forgot to mention my father was here for like 70 years, you know. He lived here, Wednesday nights, fixing things, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's what I would have changed, that we would have been a little more firm when our kids were young.
Okay. The next question in this category of how to. Any tips on how to start teaching, reading scripture as a family with your kids, especially if they don't see the point?
I think it's important to say that every kid is different and that you can try all kinds of things. You should try all kinds of things, but I don't think there's any one way to do things. And I think as I reflect, my boys are really different from one another. So whatever I think we say, I think you have to look at your own children and figure out what works in whatever stage of life. The things that we did that we're glad we did, and there's a combination of Ellen and I, when they were little, we did nightly devotions. There was a story Bible we used, and then Ellen really wanted to teach them to pray, so we did, we used popsicle sticks, and they got to write down in a popsicle stick the people they thought was important to pray for, and so every night they chose a popsicle stick, and we prayed for those people that kind of showed up. One thing that was interesting was that when they were very little, the same names would come up, and we discovered they had a real need, and we wouldn't know that necessarily. And so then over the years, they learned that God often directs prayer in light of people's need. And then as they got older, we began to change what was on those sticks to concerns they had. The transition point, we did that for years when they were in elementary school. Before that, again, we were going to church. And then when they were getting older into pre-adolescence and adolescence, we realized that the nightly devotion wasn't working. We weren't home together. So we began to do weekly manuscript Bible studies together. This was especially helpful for my son as he entered high school, and then David as he entered middle school. So we went through the book of Mark together for 2 years, then did Ephesians together. That was a really important time because we were all in the same place, we were all in the same engagement together, and in the style of Bible study it was an hour. We never spent more than an hour. We did it on Sunday afternoons. Each of our sons approaches Scripture really differently, but it was a profound experience for us to learn as a family. Ellen's response has always been that we are called to be a family of disciples, and that the role of parents when children are young is to stand for God in the family. But at a key moment when your children get older, You need to step aside and show them who God the Father is so you can kneel together before him. So she's worked really hard at that. And I think that I know it had a profound effect in how we operated as a family.
Any others?
Well, like I said, we came to this sort of conclusion that we needed to be doing a lot more when our kids were, when our oldest was probably 12 or 13 years old. And one of the things that I had heard at a conference when they were talking about tips and ideas and advice was to make it engaging and fun. And so when we started to do this with our kids, so the one thing, make it engaging and fun, and make sure that whatever it is that you're doing in terms of making changes in your habits and things like that as a family doesn't feel punitive to your kids. And I thought that those were two really good pieces of advice. So my kids, when we started to do this, they were like, what are we doing and why are we doing this? And to give them ownership, I said, no, you figure out what we're going to call this. So for whatever reason, my three girls, decided to call it staff meetings. So we would gather around and so we made it fun by giving them all a notebook with little dividers and things like that, so they could put papers and things like that in it and write stuff down, and colored pens. Each one of them had their own set of colored pens, and and it just became a fun way to engage them when they were little. And one of the things that as Chris said, there came a point in time when I started to feel like, wow, this is going over like a lead balloon, and it was as my kids were starting to get even older. And I remember hearing Ellen say something that really changed my mind and my perspective toward this. She actually said something about there comes that point in time where you're not the person who tells your kids about God, but you have to start asking them a lot more questions about what they believe and help them to begin to form their understanding of stuff in more of a dialogue kind of way. And that was incredibly helpful for me because it went, oh, good, now I don't have to do these things the same way anymore. And it's been a really life-changing experience to be more individually engaged with our kids on that level and bring up a topic or an issue and just ask them what they think and listen, and then be able to sort of point them towards some things and let them wrestle with stuff on their own. So that's really been a helpful thing for me as they've gotten older to recognize my role is going to be different now.
I know one of the things we put a lot of faith in is that we had heard, and it was like 90% of the kids who come to Christ do it outside of the church. And so we put a lot of stock in that. We sent kids to Christian camp. We sent them to mission trips and so forth where they could be engaged, not necessarily with just people from their church, but others. And I think it was a pretty good approach. But it's not easy. It's not easy just to kind of let go and make sure you still have, some connection with them. And yeah.
I think a couple of tips for me were what seemed to work well. Finally, I had a child who wanted to read the Chronicles of Narnia. That was a thrill. So I'm almost through that with my youngest, Quinn. But otherwise, just consistency with especially bedtime, with younger kids. I wish I had some other great tips. The one thing I've done recently, which has been kind of fun for me, if I just sort of pull out of the air, I'm going to start praying for my child, I find that, well, what am I going to really pray about today? So I made up this thing where I take the letters of their name, and each letter of the name stands for something, and it can change over time. So like the first letter in my youngest kid's name is Q, and that stood for quality, and so on down to the last one was, it was either nuance or next. These letters, for me, stand for something that the child either needs or excels in, is gifted in. But it's neat, and I've expanded that list. So people that are important in my life, I've assigned different words for each of the letters of their name. And I just really need devices like that to sort of keep me on track for something to pray about. So in praying for your kids, try that, if that helps you in the way it's helped me.
So here's a question that probably applies, well, either one of you can comment on this. But personally, do you take a different approach to passing on your Christian spiritual legacy with daughters than with sons? These two guys, right?
I can tell you that now I'm much meaner to the boys that come into my house.
Don?
I don't think we took a different approach at all. We looked at our two sons and daughter as equal, and I think our approach was the same. I do, however, feel that there's always that inclination to raise your son a little bit differently than your daughter. But we tried very hard to keep them together, to keep them in the spirit of who Jesus is, and to move forward with that. So we didn't really take a different approach.
Not at all. I mean, I always pray for courage and strength and sensitivity in my kids, and that was the same for everybody. So, yeah, and if I dared make any difference in my house, it would have been death anyway. So.
You wouldn't tell Ruth, right, Tim?
But I mean, on a more serious note, though, I think every kid is different. My Elizabeth has hang-ups and issues and things like that are very different than my other two, and so when dealing with her, I just need to know. I mean, I have to keep in the back of my mind, what I need to be sensitive to her with her. She's just this person who puts an enormous amount of pressure and expectations on herself and does not like it when she fails. And so she's a kid who needs to understand about grace and needs to be lavished with that in a way that my other kids don't. Aaron's very different. Aaron's just like, whatever. But she needs to know, okay, these are serious consequences. You need to be held to a little bit more accountability. So I think every one of them is just so different, whether they're male or female.
Okay. So here's a question I'd like each of you to actually comment on. Talk about what you see as specific hurdles to passing on your Christian or spiritual legacy, whether it's your child or grandchild.
I think there are a couple for me. One is to be able to have a growing conversation with my children, with my grandson who is not talking yet, but to have a real life conversation with them at whatever stage of life they're in, so that my spiritual life doesn't become a recitation of things I believe, but actually a dialogue about what God is doing in my life, which requires that I have an active relationship with Jesus where I'm being changed by it. So I'm not reciting history, but actually relating current events. And I think that's a challenge because I think I have to be able to help my sons understand how our relationship is changing as I get older, as they get older. We're not having the dialogue we had when they were 18 or 21. So that's the first hurdle. I think the second hurdle is I have to allow myself to be changed. One of the things that worries me about some of my contemporaries, so I'm over 60, is that I don't see a lot of change going on. I think some of my contemporaries live out of historic faith, but it's not a current faith. And I understand the temptation to that. And one of the great hurdles in my own life is asking the question, is Jesus changing me now? And I am in my relationship at this stage of life where my faith is actively engaged with him, and then to communicate to my children.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important point in this. You look at what Deuteronomy 6 says. It first says, you have to put these commandments upon your own heart and then impress them on your children. You can't give them something you don't have. And so you really do need to be, growing in your own faith and knowing what your own, challenges are and your own cutting edges are, and to find a way to sort of make that available to your children too, so that they know that this faith that we walk is a struggle at times. Share your triumphs with them and share some of the things that you struggle with appropriately, of course. The other thing that I would say is, for me, I think one of the ways where Satan can really get into our head and then make obstacles for us, especially as men, is in the way that we perceive ourselves. So I remember when I first opened up devotions and started to think about doing these things with my kids, and I'd look at one and go, okay, here's one on patience. Well, I can't possibly do one on patience because I'm the least patient person my kids know. And so if you allow yourself to sort of be dogged by that kind of stuff all the time, you're never going to open up the Bible and share anything with your kids. So you need to find a way to be authentic and transparent, and to just be able to sort of accept who it is that you are, and lay that bare before God and before your family. I think it's just really important. So to have a dialogue with my kids about patience is to say, what Dad's like in the grocery line. You've seen me go, why don't those people take out their form of payment before the bill is rung up? I don't understand it. We're wasting time here, or traffic jams, or whatever it is. And to say to my kids, pray for me, because this is hard for me, and hold me accountable too, because I need you to do that. So if you allow your own sense and self-image of stuff, which can be so corrupted, to stop you from being able to share the Word of God with your kids, and to engage with your kids in faith issues, just because there are places where you see your own deficits, you'll never get anywhere. And God calls us to just be faithful in all this stuff, not perfect. There are times when you're going to do devotional times or have conversations with your kids where you're going to go, that went over like a lead balloon. That was horrible. I approached it the wrong way. Whatever. But God just says, well done, good and faithful servant. You tried, and don't let that stop you from trying it again. So just the persistence and faithfulness in the midst of your own performance issues around some of that stuff too, I think can be a real obstacle.
I think there's a lot of things that go on in life right now that influence our kids greatly. And I think as I've gotten older, I've seen these things change over time. Excuse me. And I think I have a daughter who believes in God. She believes in God, she prays to God, and so forth. But she also feels there's many ways to get to God. There's many ways. You don't just have to go through Jesus. Okay? Is that a conversation for me to have with her? You bet. I have a son who's an agnostic. Okay? He's an engineer. Everything in the world is black and white. There's nothing in between. Is that a conversation to have? You bet. I have a son who's a youth minister out in Winchington or Gardner. Devoted Christian. They're all MacKays. They're all three of them come from the same Ann and I. And it's very challenging as you see your kids grow up to be able to stay with them, work with them, to pray with them, and to just love them, because they're going to take different tracks, and they're not always going to be who you want them to be. They're who God wants them to be. And we have to understand that we have to change as much as they have to change, hopefully. But to get into that conversation is a requirement, I think, for me and for Ann.
The question was on hurdles, and I think there's just so many hurdles that get in the way of having a Christian home that you really can be totally proud of. I mean, totally satisfied with. I mean, and the ultimate satisfaction comes in knowing that Jesus is the Lord of the household, and we're not Jesus. We're not. We're barely little Jesuses. I recently started to think of Jesus as the master of the house, as though he was literally present, and taking less of the heat myself for the things that don't go well, and just saying, Lord, you're in charge, and let me just do the best I can. So I like the expression that it's similar to what Kevin said, that perfection is the enemy of the good. And if all we were trying to do was, if we gave up at the point that we weren't able to be perfect in conveying leadership in our households, it would be a disaster. So I pray daily for the ability to forget all that and just be a dad who can set an example. If I had to single out any hurdle, it would probably be the challenge that at least one of my children has posed for, Dad, how can you talk about any of these things when you do such and such, and it's like, how do you answer it? Well, yes, I do. I mean, I'm a sinner and I fall short, but you still have to do this, but do the best you can at it, and look, compare yourself not to everybody else in the world around you, but compare yourself to this example. Compare yourself to this ideal. You may not get there. Maybe once in a while, Most of the time you may not. But so I do the best I can with that and get over that hurdle.
Before we go into the last category, I just wanted to invite you, if you have questions, there are index cards there. If you want to fill out a question on an area, maybe further clarification, and I'll get to that right after this next category. So this final category is on the role of discipline. A couple of questions were posed here. So the person started by saying, discipline is obviously necessary. Teaching there is a right and wrong is badly needed in our society. Sometimes I worry I am pushing too hard, and fathers are told not to exasperate their kids. Have you found ways to have a steel hand in a velvet glove, and what are they?
No.
That was the answer I was going to give. I want to go back to saying I think every child is different. So I think you have, my limited experience is I think you have to figure out who your child is and what they're dealing with at what stage of life and keep working at it. I think knowing yourself and knowing that the decisions you make about how do you help your children make good decisions are going to be agonizing ones. And sometimes you succeed and sometimes you won't. The best advice I ever got by a pastor was Earl Palmer, who is the pastor of a large church in Seattle. He said, when your children become teenagers, you need to negotiate the best deal you can get. That was very helpful to me because to be able to keep going in and negotiating over what I knew was important and I felt my priorities were, rather than trying to lay down law, which as they got older was less effective, was super helpful. And then because it kept the dialogue in and we were able to keep talking. The thing that, and again, every child is different, and so at every stage of life, I think some kids are easier than others. Life circumstances makes it hard. Sometimes there are health issues that get in the way. But I think you have to know yourself and know what you're fighting for, and then I think you have to figure out what you're willing to go to the mat for and what you're not willing to go to the mat for.
I would say one of the things when I was thinking about this question is I came back to something weirdly enough that I remember studying in the Book of Order in polity class, which says that discipline is it's not about punishment, but it's about restoration. So for me, that's something that I think is really sort of at the heart and the foundation of discipline. It's not about, how can I get back at my kid because I'm angry or frustrated or disappointed or anything like that, but how do I restore them? How do I help them to understand what they've done, help them through a process of repentance, help them come to a place where, our relationship is restored, that trust is rebuilt, that there's that sense of wholeness again, which is what we're sort of shooting for. And I was thinking a little bit more about the fact that I was at a conference this year and heard a very powerful story about a woman she's a nationally known speaker, and she was getting ready to go out on a stage, and about half an hour before, her kid's college called and said, your son did such and such a thing, and it was a horrible, egregious thing that he did, and she was so frustrated and so angry, and he wasn't picking up his cell phone, and she started stewing and becoming more and more frustrated and angry. And her biggest thing was, how can he do this to me? I get to go out there and speak in front of all these people, and how can he do this to me? And she said she heard the voice of God say, how dare you sacrifice your children on the altar of your ministry? And I thought, wow, that's incredibly profound for me as a pastor, but it's also incredibly profound for me as a dad. We need to make sure that when we discipline our children, that it's not out of that place of anger. It's not out of that place of trying to protect people from hearing about our shame as a family or whatever. We're as broken as everybody else, and we got to be able to just be okay with that. And we need to be able to not allow our children to sort of be, you're tarnishing my family's, 17 million generations of being, pillars in this church. We can't do that to our kids. So I think, we just need to be really careful to understand why we do discipline and be aware of our own stuff as we're in the process of that with them. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Be firm and be consistent. I think as you're disciplining people, if you have more than one child, they're watching you. They're watching you to see what you do to my brother or my sister. And I think sometimes it's very hard because I know if I discipline one of my sons a certain way, he'll cry. If I discipline the other son the same way, he'll walk away. You know, he's fine with it. One quick story. Lauren came home. Lauren is our oldest daughter. She came home from Girl Scout camp in Waltham, head full of lice. Okay? So Ann figured the best way to get rid of that is to shave her head, you know. Well, Lauren was not going to have that. And Ann insisted that's what's going to happen. And Lauren looked at her. She's 9 years old, by the way, right? She looked at her and said, I'm leaving this house. So she went upstairs. She got her suitcase, filled it up with her clothes, and we're going, oh my gosh, she's serious. This is like 9 o'clock at night. Out the door she goes with her suitcase going down the street. I can still see it. And do you think she'll come back? Do you think she'll come back? So we just held hands, and I don't even know if we prayed. We were probably too nervous. But sure enough, maybe 10 minutes later, which seemed like 3 hours, here she came back home. Whew, thank goodness. But if we hadn't been firm, I mean, you just have to understand that discipline is something that kids expect. And they look to you to provide discipline that makes sense. You don't want to go overboard. Like, we don't hit our kids. Some people use switches on their kids. We don't do that. That's our choice. So there's certain ways to discipline that kids see over time is a pattern. And they'll try and get around them, you know, which they're pretty smart to do. But I think being firm and being consistent are two things for us.
We thought we had it all figured out with the first four. And then, there's nurture and nature, right? And that whole theory that they both have an influence on a child. Well, we adopted our last four, so we discovered that nature has a lot to do with it. I'm sure parenting our first four wasn't easy, but in retrospect, it seems easy. So we've had to learn a whole different approach to discipline and expecting results. And I hadn't heard what you had said about getting the best deal that you can, but that's got a definite reality for us as we negotiate with our current teenagers. In order to restore a great relationship with kids, it's important, we've discovered, to be able to bounce back quickly into, hey, what's next? Let's move on. Next activity, next thing. Get some laughter back into the relationship as soon as possible. Let's go toss a ball, whatever we can do.
Thank you. So here's the last of the prepared questions. Teaching right and wrong. It's completely countercultural to tell our kids that what they hear at school from their teachers and administrators is bunk and totally relativistic. How did you do that in your finest father moments? And how did that happen over the long haul? There's an assumption here, obviously, but.
Well, I know for us, the question of what our values were was really important, and what the source of them were. And as our boys got older, being able to talk that through, so we knew why we valued certain things and how it differed from the culture around us. And recognizing that we had a lot of conversation about what it meant to be a follower of Jesus in a culture that didn't respect that or was interested in that. So there was a lot of conversation about, especially when they were in middle school and high school, they went to large, kind of wild middle schools and high schools in California. And we had to do a lot of talking about culture and values around them and what that was like and how that was different from our family and why it was different, kinds of choices they were making. The other thing that we worked hard at when there was a value being promoted that we disagreed with, to talk about why we disagreed with it. And it, at least for our sons, it was really important to try to figure out how to keep having dialogue. We had a friend who said that when our sons entered 7th grade, it was if a shutter went down across their face, and they didn't the shutters didn't go up till they were sophomores in high school, which was true. And I think there was so much going on for them emotionally inside that being able to talk about it was really hard. So we had to keep coming back and try to have conversation, asking questions, engaging. The other thing we tried to do is what some of what Don and Ann did. We tried to provide places for them where cultural values could be seen as being broader than just our family. So our deal with our boys was we lived about 25 minutes away from church, that we would, anytime they wanted to go to a church event, we would drive them. Anytime they wanted to go to a church event, we would pay for it. So we spent a lot of time on the road. But it was really important for us that they see other people. The other thing that was helpful to us, and this is a little unique, is for 9 years we had housemates, college or post-college men mostly who lived with us, who were followers of Jesus. And that really helped them as our boys got older because they saw really cool people following Jesus and reflecting the same values so that it wasn't just Ellen and I.
You gonna pass?
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I think that when we ran into trouble with our kids in terms of discipline and so forth, we really put a lot of emphasis and a lot of desire to have them know our extended family and who they were and what they were about. And as they got older, it was very encouraging for us to see that our children would use those people they met at camp, people they would meet right here, the youth director, okay, people who were associated with them outside of their mother and father. And lots of times they would resolve their own issues by dealing with, their peers. And I think that was a great relief to us, that our extended family could be people who would take on the role of mentoring and to support what their ambitions were. Because as a parent, sometimes you're just not there. You're out in left field with your thinking. And I think many times they want to find somebody, and it does take a while to do that. We all have mentors, right, in life? We all have people who we perhaps look to as someone that could be a guiding force in decisions we have to make. And it's really special to see them find them. And occasionally, a sister might talk to a brother, that, things are going wrong, so they might help each other out. But maybe you don't get that for a few years. But
I'm going to go. The thing we kind of do is compare, contrast, and correct. We look at what's expressed on media or what kids are hearing at school, compare that and contrast it to a Christian worldview, and correct what we hear that deviates from that best we can. And by keeping that conversation going, which my wife is really good at, Ruth is really good at just engaging on every topic. She's just great that way. And boy, the kids just hear it, and it's not like you have to believe this necessarily, but when they hear parents consistently saying this is the Christian worldview, makes a big difference.
Like to add anything, Kevin?
Yeah, I guess in terms of the idea of fighting the things of culture, I think my experience has been, at least especially as a youth pastor too, for years, whenever we would have topical conversations about things, to beat up on the other opinion sometimes was not the best approach. The best approach was to make a compelling picture of what it is that you wanted them to follow after. That to me seemed always to make better sense, to be able to say, this is what I want you to say yes to, and here's why. And here's why I think it's life-giving. As opposed to saying, well, the problem with what your teacher has to say, or the problem with what your friends think, they just oftentimes would just make people defensive. And I think it's better sometimes just to sort of not so much go after that, but go after what it is that you want them to gravitate toward.
Great. Did we get any questions? Okay.
This is quite an opportunity you have here because we are experts.
I'd just like to applaud all of you for very valuable information. I mean, everyone has something to contribute to all of us, and we choose to either take it in or use it. But I think the information that has been conveyed to us has been incredibly valuable. Some what we might know, other new things, approaches.
So I would like to echo that. Again, thank you, Tim, Don, Kevin, and Chris. We started off by acknowledging that no one's an expert, but certainly advice is extremely helpful. And also realizing that there are others who have walked certain parts of this journey that others of us might attempt. Randy, go ahead.
One of the issues of today is this ISIS and Muslims. My daughter, who's a 14-year-old, has grown up with Muslims in school. And how do you explain to your child that it's not a faith that's killing people, it's people that are doing it, and that the faith isn't bad. Why do they do this and claim that they're doing it because of their faith? I mean, I don't really have an exact answer to give to her. Is that I try and say, well, it's just bad people that are exploiting this faith for what they're doing. But does anyone have any comments on how to address that with the kids?
I can just say from dealing with it on college campuses, which it's an incredibly hot issue, and I think about the conversations I've had with my sons about it. Now they're a lot older than 14 at this point, but I think two things. I think the world is shrinking at one level, and so we have to become more expert in the world. That I think there was a time, certainly when I was a lot younger, when you didn't have to know as much about the world because we just didn't hear as much about the world. So I think we have to know more. I think we have to be self-educated about Islam and about the world and about culture to some extent, to have an intelligent dialogue about it. And then I think the question is to raise a lot of questions with her. What are you thinking? What are you hearing? What bothers you about this conversation? What are your concerns? What are you afraid of in this? And then raise the question, what makes it different? What are you hearing? What do you perceive about Christianity that's driving your opinion? Which parts of those is cultural? Which is not cultural? I do think the dialogue is really important. And then I think at some level we have to figure out what we think. And so we have to figure out where does faith fit and where doesn't it fit? Where are we having cultural issues? How do we feel about war? Those are really hard things. And I think it's essential that in dialogue with people who have a lot of questions, who are forming their opinion, that it's okay not to have all the answers. That to be able to say, this disturbs me, I don't know what the answer is particularly, this is where I'm leaning, this is what I understand. The last thing I would say is that I've had very fruitful dialogue with people, pretty young people who are just a few years older than your daughter, to say, why don't we go to Scripture together and figure out how this topic comes up in the Bible, and let's talk together about what this means. And you can have short conversations about that, but it allows them then to become, you end up at the same level where you're not trying to instruct, but you're trying to really have dialogue and think together and engage in dialogue about hard issues. I think my observation is that when I meet 17-year-olds who come into college, often where we lose them is they feel like they haven't had a place to have honest and intelligent and intense dialogue about hot issues of faith with their families or with the church. And so it feels like the church is anachronistic about its approach to the world. It has 4 or 5 answers, and often their parents don't have dialogue with them, so they reject faith because they feel like it's not very deep.
I think it's a tough one. Your daughter's 14, and to hear some of the things that we see going on in the world today obviously disturb us. And I agree with Chris, the dialogue is very, very critical. But here again is an opportunity for you to show her that you don't have all the answers, but that there might be people in your network, in your community, in your church that you can go to find out perhaps with her what makes sense, or to get another opinion from somebody else who may have a little more expertise. Don't be afraid to use what's it's at our doorstep. We have people right here that we could use. And anybody in this room we could ask different questions of. And that I think is really helpful because we don't have all the answers.
What makes it challenging is growing up, I know of, I didn't know any Muslims.
Yeah.
Right.
Yet in school now,
Yep.
she knows
Oh, yeah.
money,
Yeah, the world has changed.
And just trying to distinguish.
I guess the question I have is that, periodically you hear in the news about abuse situations that happen to children, often sometimes in Christian settings, whether at camps or even in churches and so forth, unfortunately. But I guess what advice would you give as far as, questions to ask or investigations to do as a parent, as far as trying to make sure that your kid's going to be safe in a context where you're bringing them or sending them to overnight camp or wherever?
That's huge.
Silence is a virtue, isn't it? We can just sit. You're asking what advice we would have for the abuse issues that we're reading and seeing?
Well, no, just as a parent, as far as trying to keep your kids safe and
Right.
not just dropping them off anywhere and not asking any questions.
Gotcha. I have a wife who grew up in it was a non-Christian home. Her parents didn't go to church. They dropped her off at church. And we were talking about, did they ever know what you could have run into when they dropped you off at church? And, when we hear about all of the abuse that goes on in child care centers and so forth, I think it still comes back to us really, really investigating when we're going to drop off our child or send them somewhere to a camp or whatever. We can only do so much work. We can only do so much research and background to find out what's safe and what isn't safe. There has to be a level of understanding that you and your wife know that I feel safe doing this. Otherwise, don't do it. Stay away from it.
Yeah, we wouldn't we wouldn't let our dog go to the house if we haven't met the parent.
Yeah.
Or at least meet him so you can form your opinion of where she's going.
And I guess I would say as one of the people on staff who's responsible for safety of our children and things like that, that I just kind of instinctively feel like I know what to look for, that there's more than one person with kids at all times, that there are those sorts of things that are just kind of common sense things. You can always ask at church too, can we see your policies, so that, or any kind of an organization really that's worth its stuff will have those sorts of things written down someplace that says, here are the policies and procedures for bringing kids to a bathroom, or one-on-one contact between leaders and kids, and how that should be avoided, and different issues and things like that. And I just think it's important that you do that sort of stuff. And if you sense that the organization is taking this responsibility on, and it thinks it's really important, then you can usually have a better level of trust. You can't guarantee anything in terms of the safety of your kids, and that's why we're supposed to continually pray for them, and pray for God's protection over them. But there are always those sorts of things that you can look to ask for.
I want to say one thing in response to that too. So it just helped me when I was a kid growing up. My parents were very clear with me. If you are in a situation that makes you uncomfortable, if you ever see anything and they wouldn't just say abusive, they were they spoke in very explicit language about things I might see or experience. They say, if you see anything like that, you please talk with us. Speak to or speak to your teacher, and they kind of put an expectation in my head that I can come to them, that I can approach them if I saw anything like that. And I think that really helped me to not feel silenced when those things came up.
You had a comment, Garrett?
I was just saying the same thing. I think there's a whole aspect to which you're talking to your kids about what's okay, what's not okay, what to do if. And I remember the first time Zach goes away for a week camp, you may have real talks about what potentially could happen when you do when these things happen. Let's say someone does something, they're going to try and tell you not to speak. You're not going to want to speak, right? Why don't they want you to speak? Because they actually realize that they're exposed if you do. They try to intimidate Jimmy, that kind of stuff. You walk through these scenarios with them, but it was a lot of that kind of prep stuff. But I think you need to look on the other end, but you also need to prepare your kids as to what can and can't be
ahead, Daryl.
Well, speaking to this issue of preventing abuse, it's gone unsaid, but I want to say it now. All of you have stayed married, and proportionally, much more child abuse is done by live-in partners. So you guys have done something that's relevant to the abuse issue and all of this. Stay married. So bless you. That's good for your kids.
Okay, we'll have one more comment from Paul. Question.
I don't want to prolong this, but I'm going to. On the abuse issue, or how people treat your kids in general, in my experience, both as a parent as well as someone who's had a lot of responsibility for other people's kids, it's a very subtle issue, but how you view your own children communicates a lot to those who also care for them about your expectations about the care they're going to receive. So, I would totally agree that any organization that you would trust with your child, you want to make sure you see the quality checks or that there's policies in place. I mean, absent that should be a huge red flag. But the yellow flags are raised when you look in someone's eyes and you talk to them and observe them with other kids or how they run their program. I'm embarrassed for my kids by being the dad who kind of hangs out or goes in to meet somebody. Like, who's the coach? Are there other coaches? Is there an assistant? In a program, a lot of times the person who you meet at the door is not the person who's taking care of your kid. So, and then if you meet that person, again, kind of how you talk about your children and the affection and the openness and the love and vulnerability that you show your own kid in their presence tells them how you expect them those kids to be treated too. And unfortunately, in a manipulative way, it does tell the person caring for your kids, that if your kids don't get treated that way, you're not going to be happy with that. So that's been my experience.
Thank you, Paul. So it comes down to how we value our kids. Well, with that, I think I will, as moderator, close this panel for now. Again, thank you, and we appreciate it.